Good afternoon, everyone. Today is a day where the nation commemorates the end of slavery. And while people of all colors celebrate Juneteenth, today's commemoration is a little different.
It stands for togetherness, it stands for solidarity.
I say Black Lives, you say matters, Black Lives Matter.
It is the celebration of the end of slavery in America.
We have to reach back down to remember where we came from in order to be successful in our future.
Black women matter.
While many historians recognize 1619 as the year the first African slaves landed in America, other historians suggest slaves arrived in America as early as the 1400s. And though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, it could not be enforced in many places until the Civil War ended. For slaves in Texas, the good news came June 19, 1865.
What do we want? Justice.
Today, 155 years later, people still honor that day.
And as people around the nation observe Juneteenth, today's celebrations are a little more somber than normal. Along with festivals and parades, people are marching and demonstrating for real change. Images from the past week show a nation divided. Protest in the wake of the deaths of black people, most notably George Floyd, a black man whose final moments were spent with a white officer's knee pinned to his neck. That officer has been charged with murder. And this week, 2 Atlanta police officers were charged with murder in the shooting death of Rayshard Brooks. He was shot twice in the back during an attempted arrest in a Wendy's parking lot. Now, these incidents, along with many others, have sparked a push for change. So joining me now is a distinguished panel of guests to discuss where we go from here and how to bring the community together. We're joined now by Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings, Vanessa Skipper from the Brevard Federation of Teachers, Orlando Police Chief Orlando Rolone, Senator David Simmons, and pediatrician Dr. Candace Jones. And joining us a little later is Dr. Jonathan Cox from UCF. He is a race scholar, and we'll talk to him about why this year is very different in so many ways. But we start with a question many people are asking, and I want each of you to offer an answer. Why does this keep happening, and what can be done to make it stop? We're going to start with Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings. Mayor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me today. The question, why does this continue to happen? I think in many cases, when we see the police deadly use of force situations that may be unjustified, it occurs because of confusion, I believe, in terms of how they interpret the behaviors of individuals that they encounter, especially those who are of color in this community. As an African American myself, who is a son of the South, who grew up here, certainly I'm well familiar with some of the things that has caused problems for African Americans over the years. I'm able to sit here on Juneteenth as the great-great-grandson of slaves and have been able to work through many of the different challenges that we've seen as a community from within our police agencies. Of course, you know that I spent about 37 and a half years as a law enforcement officer, holding all of the ranks in the various major agencies here within this area. And I fought hard to try to make certain that we had a healthy respect for one another in this community and trying to bring about the type of reform that was needed from within those organizations by intertwining myself in the moral fabric of this community and demanding that all of my law enforcement officers would do the same and that they would be part of this community and not set apart from the community itself.
Okay. Chief Rolone, would you like to answer next, please?
So, this is one time in our nation's history when all law enforcement leaders have come together and all have said the same thing. What happened in Minneapolis is not something that the law enforcement profession obviously approves of and something that should have never happened. I think also we need to be mindful that, unfortunately for the law enforcement profession, whenever something happens thousands of miles away has a way of affecting communities across the nation. I think moving forward, it is vital, it is critical that each community weigh in on how their law enforcement agencies are providing the services, how they're serving their citizens. And moving forward, we definitely need to do a better job of listening, because we do come from the human race. We are far from perfect. And we need to make sure that although we go through a very selective process to bring people into this profession, we need to be mindful that there may be someone who just doesn't represent the badge, the oath that we took to serve our citizens the right way, in a professional way. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for me as a minority chief of police, a minority member of our community as chief of police, that we need to look at ourselves really, really hard and see how we're truly policing our community.
Okay, and we'll have some follow-up questions on some of your statements, because we have questions from people, and you started to address some of the questions that people have been asking about accountability. So we'll talk to you about that in just a little bit, but we want to get everyone to still answer the same question. Ms. Skipper, can you go and ask about the question, why did you think this keeps happening in our community?
I heard it put at one point that we needed to reach critical mass in the number of people that are willing to lean in and have the difficult conversations to talk about race. We need to make sure that we understand that conscious and unconscious bias is learned at a young age, even starting in preschool. And as educators, we need to assess the way that we teach tolerance in our classrooms, assess the way that we incorporate curricula from multinational, multicultural areas to encompass the rich history that everybody brings to the table. And until we all do that, we're going to continue to struggle. Inherent bias is something that I think people look at in a negative lens, and it doesn't need to be viewed in that lens. It needs to be viewed in a lens of, let's work together to bring about our racial awareness, to look at every student in our classroom, to look at every person in our community, and to look at what they can bring to the table and how we can work together.
Dr. Jones?
Agree with all of the other answers, and I will tag on to Ms. Jeffers. Hopefully I said your name right. I think that we need to tackle racism. As a pediatrician, I know that racism has a health impact on all of us. It's harmful to all of us. As far as policing, the criminal justice system is just a system, one system within a whole system that has a long history of trauma and discrimination. And so we need to have the necessary reform and accountability and policy changes to better police our community, to protect and serve. I think as a country, we need to tackle truth and reconciliation. We need to tell the truth about racism, about how it shows up in our lives still today, and also reconcile the history and the trauma, and also start to dismantle the systems of discrimination and bias that we have that causes all of these problems. And as individuals and communities, we need to start to be more anti-racist. In this society, it's not okay not to be racist. We need to be anti-racist and fight together to dismantle racism.
It's not just enough not to be a racist. You have to do your part as well. Okay, and finally, Senator Simmons, can you answer the question, please?
Sure, and thanks for having me. And obviously, what we have here is a culmination of many of the problems that have existed in the United States from its inception. We came together to create a more perfect union, and we've not yet achieved that. And it is always a continuing process. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation occurred, and President Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, when he was elected, the South sought to secede as a result of their desire to keep their way of life. And then after the North did win the Civil War, what happened is that many of the states in the South began a process of keeping African Americans from being able to achieve true equality that was envisioned by the amendments to the Constitution that provided for the opportunity of African Americans to vote, and to also to be given the opportunity to have equal opportunity. what happened is almost 100 years of Jim Crow era efforts by people in the South, legislators and those in control, ended up causing African Americans to have a period of inequality, because separate but equal is truly a fiction. And what has happened is after the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the by the United States Supreme Court in 1954, we began the next step towards true equal opportunity for those who are minorities. And what has happened now is that there's one thing that is still existing, and that is poverty, because poverty is inextricably intertwined with racism, and those who have not had the equal opportunity, particularly now in a knowledge-based, technology-based society, can African Americans achieve the kind of equality that they're entitled to, when they have less poverty and hopefully no poverty. But the truth of it is education is the method of getting out of poverty. And I believe that that our law enforcement, because of the way that they have dealt with areas in which there's poverty, which obviously because many of them are minorities, that there has been an unconscious bias that exists. And I hope that our law enforcement, which truly 99% of our law enforcement are tremendous individuals, those same ones who during the time period of 9/11 gave their lives for all of us, and all first responders who should not be sullied by the actions of a few. Does that mean that there doesn't need to be improvement in the procedures of law enforcement to remove these unconscious biases? No, it doesn't mean that that's the case. We need to make sure that we improve our policies and procedures, but it is important, just as we've got an Orange County mayor who was a police, a sheriff for many years, dedicated his life to our law enforcement. What we have is the opportunities that exist for many African Americans and many minorities.
And we want to talk about those opportunities today.
But not enough.
Yeah, absolutely not enough. And we're going to start with, we have some people who have sent in some questions, and to piggyback off of what you said, Senator, this question goes to Mayor Demings, and talking about opportunity and equality. It says, this is one person who identified himself as a concerned citizen, Mayor. He says, can you create an affordable business program similar to affordable housing that will create greater opportunities for Black entrepreneurs?
What I will say to that is that absolutely, when we see racism in America, it's systemic, and it is caused by unequal access to capital here within America. It's caused by inadequate access to quality housing, underemployment, undereducation, and a number of those things. And so what I do like about being the mayor is that I have the opportunity to work across the spectrum to try to level the playing field for all people. And certainly we have a number of initiatives within Orange County that is designed to get more participation of minority, women-owned businesses, et cetera, here within this area. With the Board of County Commission that we have today, it's a very diverse board that is representative of our community. And I believe that our priority is on leveling that playing field. And so we have a number of initiatives that we will be unveiling very soon. We, in early spring, began the MLK initiative here within Orange County that is designed to bridge the gaps between unequal access to those things that we talked about. It's a group of volunteer citizens who are very diverse, and our goal is to tackle year-round some of the things that have been suggested by the person who wrote in. And so stay tuned for that. I look forward to the remaining tenure of my time as mayor to bring about a community that works for all people.
Okay, stay tuned. You've been doing television too long. You're giving us teases now. Thank you for that answer, Mayor. The next question will go to Orlando Police Chief Orlando Rolone. You've recently been named to the Subcommittee on Accountability and Societal Change by the Florida Police Chiefs Association. That's a new position, I understand. So someone wants to know, it says, we're curious, on a weekly or monthly basis, is a random selection of body cam footage taken for review by local law enforcement or some other accountability group? If not, is it something you consider as a way to get better understanding of how certain encounters should be handled?
So the volume of video that is collected, for example, an agency the size of the Orlando Police Department with over 859 authorized positions, as you can imagine, is huge. What we do is randomly, we do go through video just to make sure that our officers are keeping up with our policy requirements, which are to always turn on the cameras when they have an encounter with a citizen. There are specific guidelines that they must follow. And just recently, an officer was found not to be in compliance with that policy through a random check. So we do those things on a regular basis. Does it mean that every agency has the same policy in place? No. And that's one of the things that moving forward, we need to look at the national level. We need to have standardized policies that hopefully can be applied in most parts of the country, if not all parts of the country, because the way that it works right now, you may have the ideal policy with this agency, but this agency on the other end may not have a policy that would be viewed as favorable. So yes, we do random checks, and yes, I believe that it should be part of everyone's policy.
And just to piggyback on that answer, we have a question from Andrea. She says that 10 years ago, her 16-year-old son, Derek Washington, was shot by a deputy in Indian River County. And according to her, the deputy who pulled the trigger had a history of misconduct, including excessive force. And she just wants to know, what will you do, what can you do to make sure that bad actors and the hiring process is done in a fair way so officers that have done something in the past are not hired here in Orlando?
So, of course, to talk at the national level of having a registry that will identify the individuals who have been in law enforcement who are no longer or have been terminated for safe conduct reasons or any other reason, I believe that is something that we should have, a registry at the national level, not just state by state, but at the national level. We also do a very, very extensive background of our officers when they come into the profession. Unfortunately, when they do have a situation that requires an investigation of misconduct, then we have to, when it comes to a municipality like the city of Orlando, we have to adhere to civil service standards, contractual agreements. We have to look at many factors before you can say, all right, this individual has reached a point where they are no longer suitable to be a member of the agency. It is something that obviously we need to provide a better answer for our citizens. We need to look at ourselves within to see if we can develop a better method so that when we see some of the individuals that have become chronic problems, if it doesn't meet the requirements for termination, how do we address that moving forward? We need to explore that further.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Ms. Skipper. Kevis wants to know, says that it seems a lot of African American history is not taught in public schools. What can be done to address this issue? And you kind of touched on it in your answer when you said that, when we talked about why does this keep happening, and it's because we aren't educated about it.
We aren't educated about it, and I'll start my answer with how I start a lot of my answers dealing with education, and that is follow the money. We are looking at these big textbook corporations that are making billions every time we have a set of standards changed. We look at these big testing corporations for standardized testing who are writing these tests, and billions of dollars are being funneled into that. And teachers are given a set of curriculum or given a set of standards or given a set of texts to get through in their classroom so that those children can be tested at the end of the school year. And we're not putting enough emphasis on making sure that there is a cultural variety in the curricula that we're presenting. So if we can't count on the state of Florida to make sure that that happens for us, if we can't count on our local districts to make sure that as teachers in our individual classrooms, we need to make sure that we are teaching the rich texts. As we're sitting here on Juneteenth, I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass's "What is the slave? What is the 4th of July to the slave?" And that text I brought into my American literature classroom. I taught English, but I thought it was important to have because our students needed to be able to discuss that rich piece of history. So we need change at the state level, we need change at the national level, and the way that we fund education, in the way that we look at our curriculum, in the way that we buy textbooks, in the way that we divert that money into testing that has its beginnings in racism to begin with. But each teacher, each educator in the classroom also has power within themselves to make specific choices about what they're going to teach.
But how do you even get your hands or your brain around that when you have, just recently the president said that he had not heard of Juneteenth and many other people had not heard about it. So, and scheduled a rally on Juneteenth and changed it. But how do you get your brain around that so many people still don't recognize or know? And that's just an example of one thing.
It's difficult, and I think I go back to my original opening statement that until we are all willing to come together, to lean in, to have these difficult conversations, to talk about race, to talk about our own biases, to talk about what we know now, and now that we know, we do better, things won't change. I think we're on a good trajectory, and I really hope that we are able to have the bravery that it takes, the courage that it takes to have those tough conversations, not only with our colleagues, but within our classrooms, within our students, to create true safe spaces where these conversations can take place. A lot of times, you might step in front of your classroom and say, this classroom is a safe space, you can talk about what you need to talk about, but we don't actually implement that safe space. We don't teach students how to talk to one another. And I think, that as educators really come to grasp with this, they need to understand a safe space is more about just saying that it's a safe space. It's about teaching children to talk to one another, teaching children to work together. And it's about recognizing that each of us come from our own different backgrounds, and it's important to know about those different backgrounds. It's upsetting to me that people don't know what Juneteenth is, because when you're reading that speech by Frederick Douglass, he talks about what is July 4th, 1776? It certainly isn't a celebration for the slave. It certainly isn't a celebration where everybody in the nation was free. And it's important for us to be able to have those conversations, and it's important for that to be taught, because people should certainly know what today means to the African American community.
And Mayor Demings, I understand you have to leave shortly, so I want to ask you another question. And this is simply the fact that we've seen the protests evolve in the city of Orlando and around the country, really. But the protests in Orlando have remained peaceful for the most part. And they continue to happen and they continue to grow. In your years of leadership, have you seen anything like this? And does this give you pause to believe that now there may be some sort of change on the horizon? And how will we recognize it? Because it is hard to recognize something you can't even see yet.
There's going to be change that will come as a result of this, but I have to be honest that during my entire nearly 4 decades of being a law enforcement officer, it was an evolutionary process. We were always in a state of a call for criminal justice reform. From the early 80s, there were riots here in Orlando, and I hit the streets of Orlando shortly thereafter within that environment. And there were calls for police reform at that time. And there has always been some precipitating event within our community that calls us to kind of look back at it. So why does it happen? It happens because we don't have the right sensitivities to the plight of the average individual sometimes. And it happens because of failures in training, failures in supervision, failures in leadership, failures in policy, failures in terms of the entire criminal justice system. And so I believe that what is different about this time is that we have evolved to the point where we now have the technology that can provide the evidence, if you will, for the problems that we have with some of the incidents that have occurred. Whereas before, we were just relying on eyewitness testimony, memory, recall, and sometimes I think the facts get distorted in that. But now today we have the video evidence that helps us to now ensure that every person can see themselves in the circumstance. And while this had been largely a part of the civil rights movement, and that certainly involved people of color, there were other people of different ethnic origins that were involved in this fight. But what we are seeing now is this is permeated across the globe. It certainly is something on the minds and at the forefront of all of our emotions today. And so sometimes from an emotional experience, it requires an emotional response. But we do have to couple that response with the intellectual capability of a nation that's willing to change its laws, that's willing to change how we select individuals to be involved in policing, how we get involved as citizens in the process. And so I'm encouraged that the young adults who perhaps have not lived through the experience of really what racism has been in America, they will learn from these experiences and will be called to action and not just let this be a splash in a moment in time where we just go out and we demonstrate. But this has to now translate into direct action at all levels of our government, and we should be bridging the divide in America rather than further dividing one another because of the rhetoric sometimes that we hear. So I'm encouraged in this community. I want to be a part of it. That's why I have been engaged in public service for all of these years. I have stayed in the arena. I want other young people to get into the arena to feel that they can bring about the change. They can be the change. And that takes sometimes sacrifice. It takes commitment to do that. And so we're seeing now the commitment. These are committed individuals who are demonstrating in our community now for more than 2 weeks, going into the third week of demonstrations. And so from that, I'm encouraged that we will see the change that will be needed.
All right. Well, I hope you're right, sir. Certainly hope you are right. Thank you. My next question is for Senator Simmons. Dorian has a question for you about the Stand Your Ground law you helped draft. He wants to know if you've given any thought into further looking into some of the cases where that defense came into play, including the death of Trayvon Martin.
Certainly looked at each of those. The Stand Your Ground law is a law that, once understood, is actually protecting of individuals who are minorities. Why? Because each of us has the ability to use force equal to other force to protect yourself. Self-defense has always been a critical part of our society from the beginning of civilization. But the Stand Your Ground law is patterned after the court cases that were adopted throughout the United States that said that when it got to the issue of deadly force, that a person who still must act reasonably, who still must understand that that person believes that they're going to have deadly force used against them, may respond with deadly force. And the person who attacks them must, of course, have been a person who was in the wrong, who provoked the incident. And so the result of it is that rather than being an innocent victim who, when you are, for example, a woman who is in a parking lot and then someone attacks them and says that they're going to kill them, holds a knife to their neck, that they don't have to turn and run, they can actually stand their ground and maybe grab a wrist or fight back. So Stand Your Ground is limited to a very distinct issue, and that is not having to turn and run if you reasonably can stand your ground. the Trayvon Martin case was not a stand your ground case. Absolutely, unequivocally, George Zimmerman claimed that he was, pinned to the ground, so therefore there was no ability to run. The problem with the George Zimmerman case was it was overcharged, and that they did not bring up the fact that he was stalking Trayvon Martin before, and if they had raised the issue properly, I believe, in my opinion, they would have been able to have gotten a much better result. And I think that the result of it was a consequence of ignoring the fact that Mr. Zimmerman was the individual who provoked this event. So stand your ground. It is a small element of the issue of self-defense, and properly understood is actually for the benefit of all individuals who are attacked by somebody who is the wrongdoer, and the person who is the defendant is the person who is attacked is in the right.
Sure. And we all know how that played out and how that ended.
But it was not a stand your ground case. Yeah. And it's very clear, and the attorney who represented George Zimmerman made it very clear it's not a stand your ground case. And so what I think we have here is the situation in which there needs to be some revisions to the laws relating to the use of force by police officers. And I believe that that there is, once there is better training, that we will have less of the instances of what we have seen recently. However, looking at all of this, the situation with respect to police and law enforcement misconduct is truly a symptom of a greater problem, and the greater problem is the residual issue as to the inextricably intertwined issue of poverty and minorities being in poverty, and the fact that they for 100 years have had a foot on their shoulders so that they could not reach economic equality. And so I believe that this is a great opportunity to use that as a way of addressing the issues that ultimately, with respect to law enforcement,
sure,
will be improved.
And and that foot on the shoulder has now become a knee on the neck, which has become the symbol for this whole movement. So if you're just joining us, we have been commemorating Juneteenth with a candid conversation about race and inequality. Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings just stepped away, but Dr. Jonathan Cox, assistant sociology professor at the University of Central Florida, is here, along with Vanessa Skipper from the Brevard Federation of Teachers, Orlando Police Chief Orlando Rolone, Senator David Simmons, who you just heard from, and pediatrician Dr. Candace Jones. All join us for this conversation. I want to start this next half hour with Dr. Jones. I didn't get a chance to ask you a viewer question last half hour. A viewer wants to know, Dr. Jones, what every American, regardless of their race, can do to teach their children not to discriminate, hate, and profile.
That's a great question. We need to realize, first of all, when our children are born, they know nothing of racism. Racism is taught. Hate is taught. Discriminatory actions are taught. And so as we raise our children, we need to model loving and kind behavior, accepting behavior. We should not model discrimination, hate, or racism to our children. Even though we may teach them to be kind and loving and acceptingly, if we don't do it ourselves, they will follow us. More is caught than taught. And so those are the two main elements, that we model to our children appropriate behavior towards other individuals of other races, and that we also teach them to be kind and loving, that we teach them about racism, what it is, how it harms, and that it is unacceptable in your family. And those are some very basic things that we should be doing with children very early. In the African American community, we give our children what's called the talk, and we talk about it ongoing, not just one conversation. And it is a talk to teach our children what to do when they're out in the world in order to come back home safely. Those are things in the way that they would interact with the police or other authorities to de-escalate situations that they may be accused of or whatever, and just an effort to get back home to us and let us handle it for them. And so I know I've had plenty of my friends from all races reach out to me, and when we talk and I mention the talk, they cannot believe that this conversation has to be had in African American homes and people of color home. And so that shows the privilege, and they understand the privilege of being white in America, that I haven't even had these conversations with my children. So I encourage everyone to have the talk with your kids, and however it fits with you, to explain what racism is and how it hurts everyone and how to fight against it.
It is just heartbreaking, though, that you even have to say that we have to have talks with children just so they get home to their parents. And you know, the one meme that I saw that resonated with so many of my friends, like right now, it is exhausting being everyone's one black friend, because they are trying to figure out how to navigate everything. And you know, how do you even begin that conversation? What age do you begin that conversation? And how does that look in white families?
Right. So we know, as someone mentioned earlier, that children are able to recognize racial differences in infancy. And then by toddler or preschool period, they can internalize racism, those biases they are exposed to, different discriminatory acts. And by early adolescence, some of these racist beliefs are already set, prejudice and things of that nature. And so you want to be age appropriate with children, and younger children are very concrete. They may not get the concept of race, but it's important to say, hey, we're all one human race. 99.9% genetically the same, only 0.01% genetically different, which accounts for the way we look or our race or our skin color. So we tell children that, and that the differences that they see among people is beautiful and should be embraced, because it would be boring if we all look the same. And we start basic there. There are also wonderful books and shows that could show how racism plays out in kid-friendly stories, where we can engage them in those conversations afterwards. And we start there and we build on it and do it ongoing.
That's a great answer. So my next question is for Dr. Cox. Dr. Cox, I introduced you a little bit earlier, and you're also a race scholar. Someone wanted to know, what would you say to people who say all lives matter, or don't seem to understand what the movement of Black Lives Matter is all about? What is your answer to that question?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. I really appreciate being here as well. So when we think about the response, all lives matter, I think one of the ways that I've heard this really explained best is, imagine you're sitting at a dinner table, right, with your family, and they're passing out food, and your father or whoever's in charge of this meal is going to give everybody else a piece of this food, a plate of this food. They don't give you a plate, and you decide to speak up and say, hey, you know what, I'm kind of hungry, I want to eat too. And the person responds and says, well, all people should eat, right? Yes, that is true, but that doesn't change the fact that you don't have a plate, right? And so when we talk about, when we make statements like Black Lives Matter, implicit in that statement is that all lives matter, right? But the point is that we are focusing on Black lives, right? Because there are situations that clearly demonstrate that Black lives are not given the same consideration as all lives. And so when the response is all lives, really it just makes people feel like you're not listening to what they're saying. You don't really understand the underlying issues that are going on, right? And ends up being very dismissive. Again, even when a lot of people may not be using it in a way where they mean to be dismissive, and it's coming from a place of good nature, right? And it's just a lack of understanding, right? And so we want to really get people to think about their response. Why is it that you are taking away from what people are pointing to when they say Black Lives Matter by responding all lives matter? Again, it's just ignoring and further marginalizing people for the experiences that they have.
Yeah, and this time around, when we've seen the protests and the protesters, the makeup of the crowds really are very different, because there are some protests where you have more blacks than whites, but now we're seeing more whites than blacks protesting. Do you think we've turned a corner here, and what does that mean?
Yes, and so what's interesting is that's something that I have been feeling recently, that there's something a little bit different about what's happening now. And I've had that same sentiment echoed by a lot of my friends, right? As we're discussing this, a lot of my colleagues, as we're talking about what's happening right now, right? Just the sheer amount of protests that are going on, not only in the United States, but around the world, right? This is something that we have not seen on this scale to date. Right, and so there seems to be a shift in the air, right? I think there's this is a time in which there's a certain level of momentum that has been built up, right? More people are becoming aware, right? It definitely helps that we are in a society now where we have social media that's so pervasive, right? 24-hour news cycles, all these ways of getting information. Everybody, well, nearly everybody at least, has a cell phone or some instrument where they can record things, right? And so we're seeing a lot of these issues that before, again, I think Mayor Demings was saying this, that people they had to talk about, right? They had to either be there themselves to see it, or somebody had to cover that story. But now it's so pervasive, people can live stream these events happening. And so it does feel like something significant is happening. We're not sure what's going to happen as a result of this, but it definitely feels different from before. And I think a big part of this, like you're saying, is the fact that we are seeing so many white Americans, white identifying individuals all over the world, right, saying, you know what, something is really wrong. Like, people have been saying this for a long time. Yeah. I'm starting to see it a little bit more and more, and I'm understanding it better. They're taking the time to actually ask people. Again, it is a little bit stressful and tiresome at times to be that one black friend or that one friend of color that people go to. But I know for me, right, while I'm a person that would accept that burden, right, to a certain level, because I know that people want to learn, and I'm going to help to take advantage of this momentum as well.
Absolutely, definitely worth it. Okay, so my next question is for Chief Rolone, and I'm going to date myself now by asking this question from Wayne. But I remember when I was in school, McGruff the crime dog would show up, right? And Wayne says, we want to support our local police and also want our children to be anti-racist. How do we discuss police and race with children? Because being in school when I was younger, you would have contact with police, and it was always like, don't do drugs, don't do this, don't do that. And you saw a police officer in a different light. I don't feel like we're seeing police officers that way now. So what is your answer to that question? Oh no, we can't. Okay, we're having a little bit of an audio difficulty with Chief Rolone. I really want to hear what he has to say about that question, but we'll move on to the next question. I'll ask Ms. Skipper. Beverly she wants to know how teachers spend time in professional development or learning about other cultures so that they can then reinvent their curriculum.
That's one thing that we are dedicated to with the Brevard Federation of Teachers, and also our state organization, the Florida Education Association, the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, is providing school-based professional development. We offer professional development out of our offices that invite teachers to, again, learn about different cultures, learn how to integrate those conversations into the classroom, learn how to bring those rich pieces of history into a great discussion in the classroom. Oftentimes, on the school-based professional development is chosen for the teachers, and that's something that we always advocate for, because it's not necessarily training on inherent bias, or not necessarily training on restorative practices and justice like it should be. And so, we invite our districts, we invite the state to offer these rich trainings for teachers at the school level. And to begin the conversation, because if we don't have those opportunities and teachers aren't willing and ready to have those opportunities, we won't get to where we need to be in education.
Okay. Do we know if we have Chief Rolone's audio back yet? We don't? Okay, we're still working on it. Oh, so this next question is for Senator Simmons. This person wants to know, how do you feel about government and private corporations employing standards such as felony background checks, credit checks, driving history checks, and the like as part of the hiring requirement? Senator?
Well, I'm not sure what the question is addressing in the sense of phony background checks. But certainly The way our laws are today, there are necessary background checks, such as a person who is asked to drive in your, for, let's say, a delivery company. You need to know what the driving background of that individual is, because that person may have an alcohol abuse problem or anything like that that's going to cause liability for employing someone to that extent. There is what I would call a happy medium on being able to look at the background of an individual to assure that what we're doing is not really having a racist check. And I'm not aware of any of these checks as being racist. I know this, that if you're talking about credit checks on someone, there certainly would be a question about the extent that somebody would be looking at the credit to determine the qualifications of an individual. And so I would say to you that these are all things that need to be looked at, and that there are items that need to have just like we're talking about the policies and procedures of law enforcement, they need to be part of that discussion and the investigation.
This next question is for Dr. Jones, and Quentin says in terms of COVID-19, he wants to know why Black people are disproportionately affected, and can you expand on that and discuss health inequalities as well?
Yeah, so we don't know all the reasons yet. Obviously, we are still going through this pandemic, but that is being explored. I would say exploring the why has been a delay and has not been given its due, but there have been doctors across the nation, African American doctors, who have been screaming, test more in these communities, test more in certain hospitals. And so the disproportionate effect on African Americans with COVID-19 definitely could be related to, it is related to health inequity. And so when we know that in certain cities, many of our essential workers who are exposed in the community to COVID have been African Americans and people of color. We know that certain groups of people, certain areas have not received the testing that it should. Certain hospitals that serve predominant African American and people of color did not have the necessary equipment and PPE and testing. So just lack of resources. The individuals in those communities may not have access to clinics and healthcare or insurance. And so all of that lends itself to health disparity, which disproportionately affect African Americans and people of color. And when we talk about health disparity and health inequity, we have to talk about social determinants of health, and I think someone mentioned that earlier. Those things like poverty, like lack of resources, low socioeconomic status, lack of education, and we cannot forget that racism is a social determinant of health that drives health inequity. It literally causes health problems through various mechanisms. And so all of these reasons, I think, are interlayered on why, just like with all other health disparities that disproportionately affect African Americans, are layered upon this same issue with COVID.
Okay, so and another question I have for you, Dr. Jones, is when we've been watching the videos of people out protesting, the thing that strikes me the most is that there are a lot of young kids in these crowds who are protesting, and it's a great example for them to see that. But when I see, my eyes are automatically drawn to the little Black girls because they look like me. And when they are marching and their face is it's so tense, and you know, they're marching with the sign and the fist in the air, and I just feel like a child shouldn't have to be asking to treat me like a human being. Does that have any long-lasting impact on what that child will experience later? Because it's worrisome when I see it.
Yes, and you can look at it in different ways. When I see that, Certainly, I would be worried for the child in relation to COVID. Certainly, I would be worried for the child in relation to if the protests get out of hand, if there's any rioting or heavy police involvement where the child could be hurt. Those things definitely could be traumatic to the child. But showing your child that you stand up for something and you're trying to right a wrong and protest, walking down the street, raising your hand, doing the chants with people from all races as we're seeing, I think is very powerful and could be very protective. And so it just really depends on how you look at it. In the sense of racism, though, we know the American Academy of Pediatrics has a policy statement on the impact that racism has on the health of children and adolescents, everyone for that fact. And we know that racism harms our health and causes disease and mental health issues and all sorts of inequity because it can cause adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma when a child experiences racist type actions. Also, it has been shown to cause chronic stress in the lives of people who have dealt with it for many years. And that has been shown in the disproportionate rates of infant mortality and preterm birth in Black women, and even worse maternal outcomes after pregnancy. And so it just goes to show how racism hurts and shortens our lives and also causes disease. But I think in the case of the young girl, I think if she's protected and things are done the right way, it can also be empowering.
I mean, you said it best. Racism hurts. It just hurts. We understand that we have Chief Rolone back. Can you hear me, Chief Rolone?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so back to the question Wayne wanted to know. I'll repeat it so you can remember it. He wants to know, we want to support our local police and also want our children to be anti-racist. How do we discuss police and race with our children?
Well, I think we've always had programs in place like the school resource officer program, the program that you mentioned, where we proactively engage students in the classroom to talk about crime prevention, to talk about, the do's and don'ts. All of those things have always been in place, but what was not in place that here in the last 5 to 10 years has evolved tremendously is social media. Social media, television, the media itself, how the law enforcement profession is projected. Our kids are being bombarded with a lot of information, and that information is not always positive, of course. How often do you hear a story played out for 3 days when it's something positive involving law enforcement? It's usually the negative stuff that comes up and it gets repeated over and over again. That is information overload in our youth. And I think our kids haven't been exposed to that, unfortunately. There are going to, their mindset, their way of looking at a law enforcement officer is going to be affected by it. I think we need to look at how it is that we can move forward, how it is that we can maybe say we recognize that the past can never be forgotten, that the issues of today must be addressed. What do we do moving forward so that those young minds that are out there, that are the future of the law enforcement profession, will not be inclined they will be inclined to join the profession in the future rather than what we're seeing now, where we're seeing a segment of our minority population that is not embracing the idea of joining the law enforcement profession, which in turn, 5-10 years from now, is going to really affect how the law enforcement profession is viewed. Because if you don't have the representation of the people that you are serving, obviously that is an issue. And that is something that I think is a much deeper conversation to have. I think we need to look at what is the perceived view of the law enforcement profession versus reality, and obviously what is reality that the law enforcement profession must recognize moving forward.
Yeah, but so many people, we're taught, we believe that justice is blind, but not colorblind. And I feel like that's why a lot of people of color don't get into law enforcement, simply because their first encounter may not be a positive one.
And that is 100% correct, right? But what we need to look at is if you have 100 individuals and 10 experience a negative situation and 90 don't, then we need to recognize the fact that we need to dive deep into the data. The Mayor Deming said it best. The technology of today is much different than the technology of yesterday. The technology of tomorrow is really what's going to shape the law enforcement profession and our society as a whole moving forward. I think we need to do much more when it comes to analyzing and the way law enforcement is providing services. Do we have an issue? Do we have a problem that must be addressed? Absolutely. Is that issue the most important issue right now that must be addressed, in particularly with the Black Americans, the African American community? Absolutely. But I think we also owe ourselves the responsibility of looking at the overall picture, look at each community for what each community has in place, and to best analyze how to move forward from that view, not in a general way, but what do we have here? What must we do here to address our needs for our community in Central Florida?
Okay. My next question is for Dr. Cox. Shedrick asks, who else Black in America really feels free? Why is George Floyd's death shocking when it's a reality for me and my 13-year-old twin boys every day? When we show that video and people in the community start talking about it, and then you have several other examples of something very similar, and we all understand, but then when other people hear it, they're like, that happens? Is that common? Why?
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that just speaks to the different realities that exist. A big part of this, right? So we've already had some discussion or some mention, at least, of the media and how media, can portray things maybe in imbalanced ways at times, right? Just based on what sells, et cetera, right? And there are a wide variety of news networks and media networks as well, too, right? So we're looking at lots of different layers to that. Well, that's only one part of it. Another part of it is the systemic nature of segregation in our country, right? And so we are more segregated now in many places in this country than we were during the Jim Crow era, right? When segregation was a part of the legal system. And so part of what we see happening that's leading to this, the shock that some people are having at these experiences and these things that are happening now, is that they simply don't live anywhere where they are close to these things that happen, right? And so as the person who presented this question said, right, this is a reality for many of us, for many people, because we live in areas where we are over-policed, where we have negative encounters with the law all the time, where we see these things happening, or we're involved in communities where we are getting information about this a lot more, right? But if you're growing up in an area that is significantly segregated, for instance, if you are a white American and you're living in an area, we know that white Americans are one of the most segregated groups in this country, right? You're not getting a lot of this information. You're not seeing these things happening. You don't live close enough to it, literally, right, and figuratively. And so that creates a situation in which it's just a lack of awareness about what is happening. And then also, again, when we highlight, one or two or a few of these issues, then again, what ends up happening is that people then essentialize these and say, well, this must be this one out of however many thousands of positive things, when in reality, for years, we've been seeing these types of things happen over and over again. They're just not getting publicized. It was during a time where they weren't being recorded, right? There are all these different issues that are going on that just prevent people from having awareness of these facts. This also goes back to the issues of education and what people are taught when they're growing up. And so we're not taught about different things, right? So we're celebrating Juneteenth today, but people aren't thinking about, right, like the Tulsa massacre, right, where the citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, were Black citizens. They created this space for them where they were doing really, really well, right, in all areas of life. And it was destroyed in less than a day, right? And so people don't learn about these things. And so if you don't learn about them, if you're living in areas that are very segregated, where you don't have, proximity to other people that are different from you that experience these issues, then it is what we're seeing is just a picture of two very different Americas.
That was Black Wall Street, and it never came back. To this day, it has not come back.
Right.
Ms. Skipper, we understand that you wanted to add something to the conversation about education.
Absolutely. I just wanted to have the discussion about school resource officers. I know, with the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Act and all the precautions and safety measures that we're taking around our schools, one of the conversations we need to continue to have is the amount of, conscious bias training that our officers receive before they come into the educational setting. I think that they can play a critical role, and they do play a critical role in building relationships with our students on all of our campuses. And I think that the requirement right now is 8 hours of professional development. And I think that's something that our legislature should look at expanding to make sure that we get our school resource officers the training that they need to have conscious conversations and build great relationships with our students in our schools.
Okay, and our time has flown by, but I do want to ask each of you just one more question. And if you could do one thing today, if you take that back to your community, or what would that one thing be? And I'll start with Chief Rolone.
You know, I think that we need to embrace each other in a way where we're listening more instead of coming, when it comes to law enforcement profession, coming to the community and saying, this is what we're going to do for you. We should look for the community to tell us what we should do for them. And I think that's going to be something that will make us much, much better moving forward.
Dr. Jones?
I think that we need to focus on allyship. And it's very much like what Chief Rolone said. We need to white, Native, Hispanic, and we need to support one another to fight against these systems of oppression, to equalize the playing field and build everyone up equally.
Senator Simmons, one thing you would do?
Well, you can see that many African Americans, many Hispanics have shared in the success of America. That's the reason people come here. All people come here to be able to share in the success. However, there exists a large group of individuals who are minorities who have not been able to share in that success, and I believe that's because of the economic disparities that have existed in the past. And this is the time to take, for example, our young people who are students who do not have that opportunity that many others have, and provide the extra resources for those schools to provide the wraparound services so that those children will be able to rise up. They can and do learn when given the opportunity. And when we have children in an education society and a technology society, that we will have them able to compete with their peers. What you will see within a few years is a massive, massive increase in the ability of all of us, black, white, anyone, to share in the successes of America and the reason that we believe in America. And so this is the opportunity. This is a calling card for us to spend more, do more, to help those who are in economically disadvantaged.
Mrs. Skipper?
Absolutely. I think that we need to focus on being upstanders, not bystanders. The time for silence is over. If you see something, say something. If you hear something, say something. We need to teach our children not to stand by silently if they see somebody being a target of racial bias. And it's incumbent upon us to do that. It's incumbent upon our children to do that. So I would say be an upstander.
And Dr. Cox.
So what I would do is just push people at this point, right, to go out and get information, right? We're living in a time where you have literally people have access to any information at any point, right? There are so many great books that have been written about race and racism in the United States and other parts of the world. There are so many great books for children. There are movies, films, all these different things. So I suggest that people really go out, push themselves to think about their own ideas, and then also just to really focus on this idea of racism, right? There are only really two sides to this. You are either complicit in racism or you are being anti-racist, right? And so you've got to choose. That's where we are at this point.
Well, I can't thank you all enough for being here and having this conversation on this very special day, Juneteenth, as we commemorate this day. Thank you all for joining us for Real Talk, a candid conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I do want to leave you with a quote now from author Zora Neale Hurston. It's from her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. It says, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer. We all determine what this year will be." Thank you.